All right, another topic that we'll mention here briefly is evidence for evolution. And a key word is the word phylogeny or phylogenetics. This is essentially the evolutionary history of a species. What are its ancestors? What did it evolve from? So let's talk about some pieces of evidence. Let's talk about homologous features, or we might also call them homologies. These are structures in different species that are similar because they share common ancestors. Think about the arm of a human, the wing of a bat, the flipper of a whale. The DNA that codes for all three of those structures is very, 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 very similar. That's why those structures are similar. And the DNA is similar because it all came from a common ancestor shared between the human, the bat, and the whale. So DNA is sort of the ultimate homology. It's the shared genetic code of essentially all of life. Shared RNA, shared protein structure, all of those can be thought of as homologies. But if asked to give the most compelling evidence of evolution, the similarity of DNA sequences across life is by far the best evidence. Now, there are also these structures called analogous features. These are similarities in two species due to convergent evolution, rather than due to being descent from a common ancestor. Think about the wing of a bird and the wing of a mosquito. Yeah, birds and mosquitoes can both fly, but their wings are very, very different. They're coded for by very, very different DNA sequences. So even though birds and mosquitoes both fly and they both have wings, this does not imply they have common ancestry, because the genes that gave both of them the ability to fly are very different sets of genes. This indicates nature finding different solutions to the same evolutionary problem. Now, there are also structures called vestigial organs or vestigial structures. These are structures that are sort of a historical or evolutionary remnant of a structure that was important in evolutionary ancestors. Think about the appendix in a human or the pelvis in a whale. We think whales have a pelvis because their ancestors were four-legged, land-walking mammals, and that they still have that pelvis and maybe some small leg bones internally. Snakes, the same way. They have a vestigial pelvis and vestigial leg bones because we think their ancestors were four-legged, lizard-like animals. The fossil record is another really important source of evidence for evolution. No matter where you go on Earth, in the deepest layers of the rock, the oldest layers of the rock, where you can find vertebrate fossils, you only find fish. And as you come up, you'll find layers where you find only fish and amphibians. And then as you come up some more, you'll find levels where you'll only find fish and amphibians and reptiles. And then as you come on up some more, you'll find levels where you find fish, amphibians, reptiles, and then birds and mammals at about the same time. That pattern is the same all over the world, no matter where you go. And scientists would say that that's evidence that the first vertebrates were fish, and that some fish-like, some amphibians evolved from fish-like ancestors, and reptiles evolved from amphibian ancestors, and birds and mammals evolved from reptile ancestors. In addition to the fossil record, we also sometimes use what's called comparative embryology. So this is studying the similarities and differences amongst how embryos develop. And the argument is that the more similar patterns of embryonic development, the more related organisms are. We already talked a little bit about this one without naming it: comparative biochemistry or comparative molecular biology. So this is comparing either the DNA or the RNA or maybe the protein amino acid sequences, and also even metabolic pathways of related organisms. And organisms which share more of those things are more related to each other than they are to organisms in which there are more that have more differences in those things. Another kind of evidence for evolution that Darwin even cited was artificial selection. And his argument was essentially, if man can make evolution happen, so can nature. The last couple of pieces of evidence for evolution we'll talk about is just, first of all, direct observation of microevolution. we've seen resistance to antibiotics and resistance to pesticides happen within our lifetimes, within the last 75 years. Documented cases of real evolution happening. We'll also mention biogeography for a second. So looking at where organisms live on Earth and why they live there. Let's talk a little bit about marsupials and other kinds of mammals. We think probably the first mammals on Earth were monotremes, like the egg-laying mammals. And then at some point in time, from those monotreme ancestors, marsupials, pouched mammals developed. Sometimes in that area, Pangea split into different pieces. And that the marsupials, at that point in time, would have been the only kinds of mammals. Sometimes after that split, placental mammals, non-pouch mammals evolved. But they didn't evolve, those mutations that caused them to happen didn't happen in Australia, which was separated by oceans from everything else. So the placental mammals outcompeted the marsupials in most of the rest of the world, and most marsupials were extincted, with a few exceptions like the possum. But that never happened in Australia because the mutations that led to the development of placental mammals never happened there. So the marsupials continued to live there, continued to thrive. So those kinds of cases of organisms being found in only certain places, and the geographic explanations for why are also good pieces of evidence for evolution. Here we see a comparison of the amino acid sequences in hemoglobin, one of the proteins in your blood, main one that carries oxygen for us. So if you compare human amino acid sequences in the hemoglobin protein to other humans, there's 0 differences. Compare that to monkeys, there's 8 amino acids different out of 146 total. With mice, there are 27 different out of 146. Chickens, 45 out of 146. Frogs, 67 out of 146. And lampreys, a type of jawless fish, 125 out of 146. So scientists would say this means that humans are most related to monkeys, and then still pretty closely related to mice, more distantly related to birds, even more distantly related to amphibians, and even more distantly related to fish. And notice that this evidence follows the same pattern that we talked about with the fossil record. Fish first, then amphibians. Reptiles aren't on here, but then reptiles, then birds, then mammals, and then somewhere later in mammal evolution, humans. We'll also mention what are called the patterns of evolution. Darwin had this idea of gradualism. His idea was that evolution happens very slowly. So there's small variations in which certain organisms are a little bit better adapted to an environment than are others. Organisms with those genes are selected for. They have more babies and pass on more genes than individuals that don't have those genes. And this causes a very gradual, slow change in the population across time. It's slow, constant, consistent. There's also, though, an idea of punctuated equilibrium. This is when change happens very fast, in a very big way, in spurts. So there's a period of very little. There are long periods of very little change. That's the equilibrium part of the term punctuated equilibrium. And then some kind of natural disaster or plague happens, some kind of cataclysmic event. And then very fast changes happen. There's lots of speciation. There's lots of evolution. And then once the environment stabilizes again, there's very little change until the next cataclysmic event. So today, scientists think that evolution probably happens with a combination of these two ideas. That yes, gradualism is always going on, but that punctuated equilibrium happens when there are these big cataclysmic, world-changing events.